The silver cross lay on the altar like it had survived a storm all by itself. Edge's bent chain kinked a dull shine, catching the candlelight. No choir sang. No one spoke. You could hear only the faint tick of the wall clock and the air shifting in the rafters. I didn't touch the cross. I just watched it tremble in the glow as if it still remembered the hands that carried it here. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. On ordinary mornings, my apartment on the edge of Baton Rouge felt like a place where the day started gently. The freight line out past the levee groaned at about 5:30, same as always, and the smell of chicory coffee drifted from the corner diner when I cracked the kitchen window. I wrote at a small table that wobbled if I leaned on it, and I liked it that way. You don't forget you're alive when your furniture argues with you. By 8, the air would warm into the high 60s, and sunlight slid across the floor in a slow river, quiet, modest, dependable. That's the kind of peace you learn to build when the world has already shown you what it can take. I kept my work simple: courthouse filings, small-town profiles, the sort of stories folks read between errands. I interviewed veterans at the American Legion Hall and wrote about a high school marching band that rebuilt after the pandemic thinned its ranks. People sent me old photographs in manila envelopes with tape so yellow it looked like resin, and I'd call them back and listen. Listening was my real job. A good voice recorder, a steady pen, and the patience to let anyone finish a thought. Those were my tools. I never rushed to the point. I let the point come to me. I learned that from my father when I sat in the front pew and watched him set down his notes and speak to the room like he knew every soul in it. Cross Lake Hollow sat 2 hours north and a little west, a cluster of streets that forgot to grow when the state highway turned elsewhere. Pines pressed in on the edges, and the church steeple pinned the sky right where the river made its laziest bend. In summertime, the old filling station sold snow cones that turned kids' lips blue. In winter, the gray settled low and long, the kind of sky that made you think in whispers. My father used to say the air there was slow with purpose. I always believed he was describing the congregation. Later I realized he was asking them to be careful with one another. If you stood on the frontage road at dusk, you could hear the chapel bell if the wind came from the east. I remember that sound better than my own name some days, the single note that dropped over the town like a blanket, not loud, not soft, just final. The bell marked everything: marriages and potlucks and the end of Wednesday night choir practice. The bell also marked the night when people told me to go home and stop asking questions. I did for a long time. I smiled, paid the mortgage on a small life, and learned to line up my coffee filters exactly the same way every morning. A person can survive on routine. A person can hide inside it too. On my desk, I kept a little bowl for paper clips and one faded photo tucked beneath the glass blotter. The photo had been taken on a Sunday, I remember, by the warmth of it. My mother's hand steady on my shoulder. My father with that unguarded grin he didn't know people liked, and a skinny kid with a pink raincoat standing a step ahead of us because she was always running. I never talked about the picture. I never moved it either. If I slid it even half an inch, I felt like a season would change too quickly and take something with it. The past wasn't a subject I avoided. It was a guest I let sit in the next room with the door cracked open. On nights when the radio drifted to hymns, or the weather turned the air the color of old tin, I'd hear a hum, and I'd know exactly where it came from. That's what memory does. It tunes you to a frequency you can't switch off, and one day it will bring the signal back clear as day. In Baton Rouge, my neighbors were the kind who waved with a chin nod and paid for Girl Scout cookies in exact cash. Saturdays, the man across the hall rolled a bucket down to wash his truck, and the hose water made dark rivers along the curb. On Sundays, I walked to the diner and took the back booth under the clock that was always 5 minutes fast. The waitress called me Hon, not because she forgot my name, but because she knew I needed someone to say it. The cook would tilt the radio toward the Saints game when it came on, and old men in ball caps would discuss the weather like it owed them money. These people had nothing to do with Cross Lake Hollow, and I was grateful for that. They didn't ask me about fires or funerals. They asked if I wanted my toast dry or buttered. Every so often, a letter from home would find me. Usually a church bulletin someone thought I'd like to see, or a clipping from the Lincoln County Ledger about the fall festival. The envelopes smelled faintly of attic and pencil shavings. I'd set them on the table, let the paper settle, and then slide them under the bowl for paper clips after I read. They went there with the bank statements and the appliance warranties, things I needed to keep but didn't want to look at. I kept my apartment cool 68 degrees, the way my mother did when she wanted the windows clear. In that light, dust moves like snow you can't touch. I watched it sometimes and thought about the parsonage floorboards, how they threaded through the rooms like a low song. I could make it through most days without thinking of the night that changed everything. If I was busy, I could make it to bedtime. But when the kettle began to sing and I turned away to reach for the mug, that's when the hum would return, thin as a child's voice behind a door. I drove up to Cross Lake Hollow once or twice a year to see the marker that carries my parents' names. The cemetery sits on a small rise a few hundred feet from the pecan trees, and the ground feels steady there, like good work has been done under it. I'd park on the grass step, careful between the stones, and set down flowers that didn't need much water. I never stayed long. I listened to the wind drag itself through pine needles and watched the chapel roofline hold its posture as if the building were a person waiting to be addressed. I'd tell my mother what I was working on, tell my father a story about a man who taught his son to tie a tie with one hand. Tell them both that I was fine. Then I'd drive back to the highway before anyone saw me and turned that into a different kind of visit. The town still held its old habits close. The grocer stacked apples in careful pyramids that made everyone nervous. Miss June at the post office wore bright scarves and stamped the mail like each letter had a pulse. The general store sold nails by the pound and kept a ledger in pencil because the machine forgets who we are. Folks nodded in that narrow way that says hello without inviting grief to sit down. I understood. Cross Lake Hollow could be kind, but it had also learned to draw a curtain fast. People there carried each other's summers and winters like secret packages, and nobody wanted to see anyone drop one. When the parish closed the old rectory and turned it into a 3-room inn, they painted the porch the color of buttermilk and hung chimes that sounded like teaspoons tapping saucers. Bernice Cole ran the place with a quiet that put people in order. She had a ledger with room keys on brass fobs and a memory that kept track of which guest liked orange marmalade and which wanted black coffee at 6 a.m. sharp. Bernice used to hand out choir robes on Wednesdays. She could hem a sleeve straight as a plumb line and had a way of noticing who slipped out the side door when the bell rang the last time. If Cross Lake Hollow had a conscience, it sounded like Bernice clearing her throat before she spoke. I saw Jacob once at a funeral I wasn't planning to attend. I'd gone to the store for bread and walked out holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil because someone said they were short on sides. I set it on a folding table at the fellowship hall, and there he was, sleeves rolled up, setting out iced tea like he didn't mind his hands catching cold. He hugged me like he'd been expecting me all day. We made small talk in the quiet way people do when anything larger might crack something they can't repair. He told me the choir was thin and the roof needed work. I said my car was running fine, which was not what either of us meant. The chapel itself hadn't changed. Red brick, white trim, a cross that needed paint at the very top. The floorboards remembered where I stepped when I was 8. They answered back with the same creak at the third pew from the front. Sun through stained glass still made the air look full of dust that forgot how to land. If I closed my eyes, I could place the sounds in order: the latch on the sacristy door, the bark from the neighbor's hound 2 houses over, the heat knocking once before it decided to work. None of this was ominous to me. It was the opposite. It was comfort, the kind that can fool you if you're not careful. Money was always tight in towns like ours, but people made do. They traded pecans for fence posts, casseroles for rides to the clinic over on Route 9. Widows kept each other's porches swept. Grandfathers taught kids to bait hooks out at the slow bend where the lake gives up its ambition and rests. On Sundays, men dug into pockets for crumpled bills, and women folded them smooth before placing them in the plate. The world we kept together was small, but it ran on kindness, measured in inches, an extra blanket. In the winter, a porch light left on until a teenager came home, a note tucked under a door when a word was safer on paper than out loud. I had my own set of rituals: laundry on Thursdays, gas tank never below a quarter. Keep a 20 in the glove box because you never know who might be short for a prescription at the drugstore. I told myself I'd done the sensible thing. The past was not a map. It was weather. You respect it, you dress for it, and you trust the forecast only as far as you can see the clouds. Every once in a while I'd be driving late 2 lanes of blacktop, unspooling in my headlights, and I'd come to the turnoff for the old Winslow place without meaning to. The road narrowed there, the gravel fresher, because the county never stopped trying to keep it passable. If I pulled over, I could feel the engine's heat moving through the hood and see in the corner of my eye the dark square where the house used to stand. Pines kept their own counsel at that hour. If the wind hit just right, the scent of damp earth worked its way through the car vents, and I'd get the feeling a person gets when someone has said their name in another room. I knew which nights not to trust myself. On those, I took the long way home along the river road and let the radio fill the car with station chatter about fishing tournaments and a sale on lawn seed at the co-op. Familiar nonsense is a good anchor. It tells your mind there's still a world where the size of a fish matters, and a lawn can be repaired with a bag and a rake. The first faint crack in that easy, ordinary life wasn't a sound at all. It was a silence that extended past where it should have stopped. A call that usually came on Tuesdays didn't. The church bulletin that usually arrived by Friday didn't land in my box until the following Wednesday, and half the back page had been torn off clean like someone needed the paper for a list. I told myself the post office was backed up. I told myself I was busy. On Saturday, a man I didn't recognize watched me parallel park outside the diner and then watched me again when I left his window rolled down the smell of stale cigarettes carrying across the lane. He nodded once when our eyes met. I nodded back because that's what people do when they don't want to start something. That weekend, the air dipped into the low 50s and the pecan trees shook out the last of their leaves. A front pushed across the state low and steady, and the weatherman said we'd have fog until mid-morning. I woke before dawn and listened to the neighborhood breathe a dog collar jingling, a truck door thudding shut, the elevator cables humming behind the wall. I made coffee, set the mug down, and stared through steam that curled like handwriting I couldn't read. The city sounded the way Cross Lake Hollow does right before the chapel bell, expectant, careful, almost polite. I had no plans to drive north that day. I had planned a column about a woman who turned her late husband's workshop into a place where kids could learn to mend their own bikes. I had planned laundry and a phone call to a friend who lived out near Shreveport. My to-do list looked like a handful of fence posts, ordinary, sturdy, useful. I set it beside the bowl for paper clips and reached for my keys anyway, the way a person reaches for a sweater when they don't feel cold but know they will. By the time the sun started to lift the fog off the river, I'd pulled into my parking spot and crossed the breezeway to the mailboxes. The metal doors were cool under my fingers. Someone had left a penny wedged in the crack of number 12 for luck. The hall smelled faintly of rain and rubber soles. I slid my key and turned and felt the latch give. Inside a small stack of nothing special sat squarely in the center electric bill coupon mailer, a flyer for a jazz night at the bar that never could keep a drummer. And on top of those resting like it understood, it didn't belong there. An ivory envelope with no stamp, no postmark my name, written in ink so pale I had to angle it to the light to be sure it said what it said. I stood very still and listened the way you do when a house settles, or when you think you've heard your name from a long ways off. I didn't open the envelope in the hallway. I didn't open it walking back to the apartment. I set it on the kitchen table and let the room fill with the soft tick of the clock and the whistle of my kettle coming up to a boil. Outside, a car door shut. Somewhere upstairs, a TV murmured. Across the street, a porch light that shouldn't have been on this late in the morning burned steady, a small circle of brightness that made the fog look thicker around it. I watched that light and kept my hands near the envelope, but not on it, as if it might tell me what it carried if I gave it one more minute of quiet. I didn't open the envelope right away. It sat there on the table while the kettle went from a low whistle to a sharp cry, filling the kitchen with that thin, metallic sound that makes a person feel watched. The paper itself looked older than it should have been, ivory, with edges that curled like it had lived in someone's drawer for years before it found mine. My name on the front wasn't quite my handwriting, but it was close enough that for a second I thought maybe I'd written it to myself and forgotten why. When I finally broke the seal, there was no letterhead, no date, no signature. Just 7 words in a hand that trembled toward the end. She's not dead. Look in the well. I must have read it 5 times before I set it down, each time slower, waiting for the words to rearrange into something rational. They didn't. The next morning I drove north before the sun had cleared the rooftops. The highway was still wet from the night's rain, and the radio whispered static between AM stations. By the time I passed the county line, the air had cooled enough to fog the windshield at every stoplight. The turnoff toward Cross Lake Hollow came and went before I could decide whether to take it, but halfway to Monroe I swung around, pulled onto the shoulder, and sat there a long minute with the hazards blinking against the dark pines. Going back wasn't in the plan. It never had been. But the thing about unanswered questions is they start to hum after a while, and sooner or later that hum gets louder than the life you built to drown it out. The old Winslow property sat on a rise past the orchard where the road ran out. I'd expected overgrowth and ruin, but what hit me first was the smell, the way pine needles and damp ash carried the same sweetness they did the week after the fire. The chimney still stood stripped bare, surrounded by what used to be walls. I parked near the old fence line, the gravel soft from years of neglect, and stepped out. My boots sank into earth that gave too easily. Every sound carried farther than it should have. When I was a kid, you could hear cows from the neighboring field or the clink of my father's tools in the shed. That morning, nothing. Just the wind slipping through the hollow frame of what used to be home. I hadn't been back in almost 20 years, not since the service where they buried 2 coffins, one full, one empty. Folks said it was merciful. A place to lay flowers, the undertaker called it. I'd tried to accept that, but standing there again, the ground still smelled like smoke when I kicked at it. I found myself looking for signs of her, even though I knew how foolish that was. Elise had been 8, small enough to fit under my arm when she got tired on the walk to church. She loved bright things, blue ribbons, pink rain boots, the glass marbles we kept in a coffee tin by the porch. After the fire, the sheriff's report said the blaze burned too hot to recover much. They told me that was closure. I pretended to believe them. The letter in my pocket made a faint crackle each time I moved. Look in the well. It was absurd, maybe even cruel, but I couldn't ignore it. The well had been boarded up years before the fire. My father nailed the cover himself, said it was dangerous. A mouth that doesn't close, he called it. We never went near it again. That morning I walked past the line of pear trees that used to mark the back edge of the yard. Their branches were brittle, half broken from storms, but the rows were still straight. You could tell where the orchard ended because the light changed. The trees thinned, and there it was, the old stone circle half sunk into the earth, its wooden lid caved and mottled with moss. The nails that once sealed it had rusted away. Somebody had pulled them out one by one. I knelt beside it, brushing the dirt from my jeans. Inside was darkness, but not the kind that swallows light. It had texture, depth, like the air in a basement that's never been opened. I leaned closer, the beam from my phone cutting a pale column into the void. About 10 feet down, the light caught on something metallic. A ladder. Not wood. Steel bolted into the stone. My father hadn't done that. This was newer clean under the rust, too straight to have been here before. I could have turned back then. I could have told myself the letter was a prank, a sick coincidence. Instead, I slid my flashlight between my teeth and started down. The rungs were cold, the kind of cold that seeps through gloves. At the bottom, my boots touched dry soil. No water, no echo, just the hush of a sealed space. I turned slowly, sweeping the light around. The well widened into a small room carved into the rock, maybe 10 feet across. Shelves lined one side, old jars, a rusted oil lamp, a trunk with its latch broken. It might have been a storm shelter once. Then the light caught color. A small dress folded neatly on a wooden stool. Powder blue, trimmed with white lace along the collar. The fabric hadn't decayed. I stepped closer, my pulse climbing. Elise had one just like it. Not similar exact. My mother sewed it for Easter the year before the fire. I knew every stitch because I'd helped thread the needle. The beam from the flashlight slid higher up the wall behind the stool, and there it was, letters scratched into the stone with something sharp. Uneven, shallow, but legible. Elise was here. The words blurred for a second when my eyes welled and I had to steady my breath. The floor held footprints newer than they should have been. I pressed a finger to one. The dust clung damp, recent. Someone had been down there not long ago. Someone who knew where to find it. I backed toward the ladder, trying not to look at the dress again. When I climbed out, daylight hit like a wave. The orchard swayed in a slow rhythm, and the world smelled of wet moss and pine needles. Then, on the hearth of what used to be our living room, I saw another envelope. Ivory paper. Red wax seal pressed with a cross. It hadn't been there when I arrived. My name again written in that same faint hand. I opened it carefully. The paper inside was thin, almost transparent, written in a hurried scrawl. You're not wrong to come back. She never left. They all lied. The fire was never meant for him. It was meant for her. I stood there with that letter trembling in my grip. Her. The word cut deeper than the others. The fire was meant for her. For Elise. My father was the one everyone said caused it faulty wiring in his study. Maybe a candle left burning after evening prayer. Now this letter twisted every version I'd been told. Who would have wanted to harm a child? I stayed there until the shadows lengthened and the chill came back into the air. The orchard creaked softly, branches rubbing together like whispering hands. By the time I reached town, the last of the light had drained from the sky. Cross Lake Hollow looked smaller than I remembered. The Texaco sign still hung faded red above the one pump that worked when it wanted to. The general store's porch sagged the same way it had when I was 10, its boards groaning under gossip and rain. Heads turned as I passed. You could almost feel people noting the car, the face-the-family name that still lingered on the church roster, though no one spoke it. I pulled up at the Parsons Inn, its porch light burning steady through the mist. Bernice Cole stood behind the counter, gray braid over one shoulder, glasses perched low on her nose. She looked up once, then twice, as if she'd been expecting me all day. "You must be Mara," she said, voice even no surprise in it. I nodded, setting my bag down gently. "You've got your mother's jaw," she said, and that look she had when she knew something before anyone else did. She slid a key across the counter brass tag marked with a 2. "Room's ready. Sheets are warm." I thanked her. She gave a small nod, but her eyes didn't move off mine. "People might act like they've forgotten what happened," she said quietly, "but they haven't." I didn't answer. Neither did she. The clock behind her ticked once, twice, and that was the end of it. Room 2 smelled faintly of lavender and dust. A Bible sat on the nightstand, a pressed flower tucked between the Psalms. I set the new envelope on the desk beside the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. The air felt heavier there, like the town itself had lungs that exhaled slow. Through the lace curtain, the street looked empty, but I had the sense of movement, someone crossing the square, someone watching from a window that shouldn't have light at this hour. I turned the lamp off and lay back, the ceiling faintly cracked above me. The dress, the writing, the letter, they ran together in my mind until sleep caught me somewhere between disbelief and memory. Before dawn, I woke to the sound of rain on the roof and the echo of my father's voice, something he used to say at the start of sermons. Even silence speaks if you sit with it long enough. I got dressed and drove to the chapel. The sign still read, Pastor Matthew Winslow, though he'd been gone 20 years. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and old paper. Candles flickered near the altar. The pews gleamed from fresh polish hymnals stacked straight as soldiers. At first, I thought I was alone, but then a man stood from the front row, sleeves rolled up, sorting books. When he turned, I recognized him before he spoke. "Mara," he said, cautious but warm. "Jacob Renner, I'll be damned." He hadn't changed much, older, steadier eyes with the same calm I remembered when we were teenagers and the world still felt intact. "You're still here," I said. "Deacon now," he replied. "Temporary preacher while they look for someone full-time. No one stays long." His voice softened. "What brings you back?" I hesitated, then said, "My sister." The word caught in my throat. He frowned, waiting. "I found something," I said finally. "At the house." We talked in low tones by the altar. I told him about the cellar, the dress, the writing on the wall. He listened without interrupting, though his hands worked the cloth he'd been using to polish the candlesticks until it tore in half. When I finished, he said quietly, "There was never a cellar in that house." I met his eyes. "There is now." He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in something like dread. "Mara," he said, "whatever you found, maybe it's better to let it rest." "You always believed me," I said. "Don't stop now." He was silent for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right," he said. "Let's find the truth." By the time we left the chapel, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low. I followed his truck to the county annex, a squat brick building that smelled of mold and toner. In the records room, the air was thick with dust. We went through blueprints, land deeds, anything that still had legible ink. Every version of the house plan stopped at the same point, a crawl space no deeper than 3 feet. Nothing about a cellar. Someone had built it later off the books without permits or reports. To hide something, I said. Jacob didn't argue. He rolled up the blueprints, eyes dark. That night, back at the inn, a noise at the door woke me. It wasn't a knock, just the faint scrape of paper sliding under wood. I waited until the footsteps faded before I moved. On the floor lay another note, folded twice, no name, no seal. 3 words in that same faint ink. "Look in the well." I stood there barefoot, the air from the hallway creeping in around my ankles. The words glowed pale under the lamplight, and for a long time I didn't breathe. Someone had been near enough to know which room was mine. Someone who wanted me to keep digging. I walked to the window, lifted the curtain. The street below was empty except for fog pooling at the curb. Across the square, the chapel bell tower cut through the mist, still silent, waiting. And in that stillness, I felt it again, that low hum of something unfinished, something alive under the surface, waiting for someone stubborn enough to listen. The fog hadn't lifted by morning, hanging low enough to brush the car hood as I turned back toward the orchard. The note. "Look in the well" lay on the seat beside me, folded in half, the crease worn soft from my thumb. I kept glancing at it like it might change its mind if I blinked. The air smelled of damp leaves and rust, that clean scent that always comes right before something shifts. When I parked at the edge of the property, everything looked different in daylight. The trees stood motionless, bare-limbed and gray, like an audience holding its breath. The well waited in the middle of it all, the wooden lid sunken in on one side, moss clinging to the stones like old bruises. I walked closer, boots cracking twigs beneath the dead grass. The silence there wasn't empty. It had weight to it, as if the ground itself remembered what happened. I leaned over the opening flashlight in one hand, rope in the other. The air that came up was dry and cold, carrying the faint smell of stone. 10 feet down, the light caught metal again, same ladder I'd seen before. But now that I looked closer, I noticed bolts drilled clean into the wall. That meant someone had been down here more than once, not decades ago, but recently. My heart beat slow and deliberate as I began my descent. Each rung bit into my gloves, the sound of my boots echoing off the walls. When I reached the bottom, I found more than I expected. The floor was dry, swept clean, and in the middle of that small underground space stood a wooden chair. On its seat, folded neatly, was a pale pink blanket, the same kind my sister used to drag from room to room when she was little. One corner was frayed, a few threads pulled loose and tied again with clumsy fingers. Beside the chair sat a small metal lunchbox, paint-chipped and edges dented. I knelt down my knees, pressing into cold dirt, and ran my hand across the lid. It opened with a soft pop of rust, and inside were crayons dulled with age and a notebook. The first few pages were filled with drawings, simple lines, stick figures standing under a cross, a house, a river, a sun with too many rays. But as the pages went on, the drawings changed. The faces lost their eyes, their mouths until they were just outlines of people without expression. On the last page, written in a child's uneven hand, were the words, "He said, if I stay quiet, Mama will come back." I closed the box and sat there for a long time. The dirt smelled faintly of candle wax and dust. There was no sign of life, but the air felt recent. Not abandoned, not decayed. Like someone had been keeping the place clean. My flashlight flickered, and in the half-dark, I thought I heard a soft scrape metal against stone from somewhere beyond the wall. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the echo of my own breath. I climbed out slower this time, every sound behind me stretching too long in the silence. When I reached the top, the light hurt my eyes. Jacob was waiting by the truck when I pulled up at the chapel, his face pale under the brim of his hat. "You went back," he said. I didn't bother answering. I just held up the lunchbox. We took it inside, setting it on the altar beneath the dim, stained glass. The colors above us made the air look bruised. When he opened the box and saw the drawings, his hands shook. "You're sure this was down there?" he asked. "I didn't imagine it," I said, quietly. He read the last page and let out a low exhale. "Who's he?" "That's what I need to find out. Jacob told me there'd been a man years ago, a deacon named Elias Root. Came to the church around the time of the fire, volunteered for everything, stayed late to help clean the chapel. Said he left town after the tragedy, but no one saw him leave. His records disappeared not long after." Jacob's voice dropped when he said the name, like speaking it too loud might wake something that had gone to sleep. The way he described him, quiet, obsessive, fond of secrecy, made the hair rise on the back of my neck. "If he's the one who built that cellar," I said, "then maybe it wasn't meant for storage." Jacob didn't disagree. That night at the inn, another note slid under my door. I heard it before I saw it, a soft whisper of paper on wood. My hands hesitated before reaching for it. The handwriting matched the others, faint, precise. "Don't trust the church. Ask Bernice what she saw that night." I stared at it until my pulse settled, then grabbed my coat and went downstairs. Bernice stood behind the counter, wiping down the wood like she always did before closing. The TV in the corner played low news chatter that didn't belong to this world. When she looked up, her eyes met mine, steady, unflinching. "I was wondering when you'd ask," she said before I spoke a word. We sat in the kitchen, the smell of cloves and coffee in the air. The window over the sink rattled slightly in the wind. "What did you see?" I asked. Bernice set her cloth aside and folded her hands on the table. "I saw someone leave your house before it burned," she said, carrying something wrapped in a blanket. I waited my throat dry, I couldn't see his face. Tall man, coat collar turned up. He didn't go toward town, he went through the orchard. She took a breath, then added, "And it wasn't your father." The clock on the wall ticked louder in the pause that followed. Bernice's eyes stayed on her hands. "I didn't tell anyone. The Hollow doesn't forgive women who talk too much." I nodded slowly. "Then you think he took her?" "I think someone did. And I think this town helped him keep it quiet." She reached for the coffee pot and poured herself half a cup, black and steaming. "Whatever you're looking for, Mara, be careful. Some ghosts down here don't like daylight." The next morning was gray and cold enough to numb your fingertips. I met Jacob again at the orchard. He'd brought gloves, a flashlight, and a coil of rope. We worked in silence, lowering ourselves into the well. This time, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what else we might find. The air down there was still the kind that feels older than you are. We moved the chair aside and started checking the walls, inch by inch. Jacob's flashlight caught something near the base, a small section of brick that looked newer than the rest. He pried at it with a flat tool until one of the stones came loose. Behind it was a small tin box rusted shut. We opened it carefully. Inside lay a Polaroid photo, edges curled, color almost gone. It showed a child sitting on a dirt floor, clutching a doll with one glass eye. Her hair was tangled, her face smudged. I didn't need to read the back to know, but I did anyway. In pencil, someone had written, "She cries too loud. We'll fix that soon." The words made the room tilt. I turned away, my throat tight. "Elise," I whispered. Jacob said nothing, just stared at the picture like it had taken the air out of him. We climbed back up slower this time, the box between us. Once we were above ground, I sat on the mossy stone and looked at the photo again under the weak light. The image blurred each time I blinked, not from tears exactly, but from disbelief settling into something harder. "She was alive," I said quietly. Jacob nodded. For a while. We decided to look through church records again. If Elias had been part of the congregation, there'd be traces. Jacob unlocked the office behind the chapel where old ledgers and baptism books sat in neat rows of dust. We flipped through page after page until my eyes blurred. Then I saw it. Elise Winslow. Date June 15th, 1996. Location Cross Lake Hollow. Officiant Deacon E. Root. The date hit me first, 2 years after the fire. I stared at it until the ink seemed to tremble. Jacob's voice was low when he said, "He baptized her." After. I nodded, barely breathing. That night, back in my room, I laid everything out on the bed, the letters, the photo, the baptism record. The story they told didn't fit in any straight line. My sister hadn't died in the fire. She'd been taken, hidden, reborn into someone else's care or control. I thought about the phrase scratched into the stone wall Elise was here. Maybe she wrote it. Maybe someone wanted me to think she did. I didn't sleep much. Every sound in the hallway made me reach for the light. Around midnight, I walked to the window. Across the street, the chapel stood dark except for a faint glow from the loft window, the same one that used to leak rain when we were kids. The light flickered once, then went out. I went back to the table and unfolded the first letter, the one that started all of this. "She's not dead. Look in the well." Whoever wrote it knew everything. Knew where to send me what I'd find and when I'd be ready to see it. I wondered if they were still watching, waiting for me to catch up to the truth they'd been living with all along. Before dawn, I gathered my things and headed out to the truck. The sky had that pale, pre-morning color, neither dark nor light, like the world hadn't decided which way to turn yet. The fog was back thicker this time, rolling across the fields and swallowing the road ahead. I stopped at the edge of town engine, idling my hands tight on the wheel. Somewhere beyond the trees lay a man's name buried in church ink and a child's voice that never got to finish its song. I looked in the rearview mirror at the faint glow of the inn's porch light disappearing behind me, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure at the end of the street still watching just far enough away to vanish when I blinked. The fog closed in and I drove forward knowing this wasn't over. It hadn't even really begun. The fog thinned as I drove toward the edge of town, dissolving into strips that clung to the treetops. The air was sharp enough to taste wood smoke, iron, and something older like wet stone. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that turning back had stopped being an option somewhere along the way. Every mile out of Cross Lake Hollow felt like stepping deeper into the past, the kind that never stopped echoing. By the time I reached the road to Cedar Bend, daylight was breaking in thin ribbons through the clouds. The farmhouse sat at the end of a narrow lane roof sloped low and shutters drawn tight. The fence leaned inward, as if even the wood had learned to keep its secrets. Jacob pulled in behind me, headlights dim. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The house looked sealed, not abandoned. The boards across the lower windows had been nailed from the inside. A barn crouched beside it, smaller than I remembered, its doors chained shut. I felt the same heaviness I'd felt standing at the well, the kind that sits between your ribs and won't leave until you move toward it. We didn't have a warrant, didn't even have a reason to be there besides instinct. But instinct had gotten us this far. When Jacob cut the chain, the sound rang out like a bell. Inside, the air was dry and cold, layered with the smell of dust and wood oil. Sunlight leaked through gaps in the planks, drawing stripes across the floorboards. Broken pews were stacked against one wall. A baptismal basin lay on its side in the corner, cracked down the middle. Someone had kept all the remnants of a chapel here as if they couldn't let the faith die, only move it underground. I ran my hand along the wall and my fingers caught on something rough. Beneath a layer of grime was a child's drawing, thumbtacked at eye level. Faded crayon lines across, a stick figure, a house. It shouldn't have survived years of weather, but it had. Jacob lifted the edge of a tarp nearby, and what we saw underneath stopped us both. A small bed-iron frame, the mattress sunken in the middle. The blanket folded at its foot was pink embroidered with tiny stars. "She lived here," I said quietly. My voice didn't feel like my own. Jacob flipped through a nearby journal, its pages lined with a man's cramped handwriting. He read aloud March 1997. "She sings to herself now, calls the doll Mother. I think she's beginning to forget." He closed the book like it burned. "My God, Mara," he said. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that would make sense of it. We stayed there longer than we should have, reading in silence. The words on those pages told a story I hadn't been ready to hear. They spoke of obedience, of redemption, through silence of a child who was spared from fire to be remade in grace. Each sentence bent further from faith into madness. The journals ended abruptly in 2005. After that, just empty pages. On the back of one, drawn in charcoal, were 4 names: Elise, Naomi, Claire, and Lily. Underneath them, another line in a different hand, written softer. One forgot, one prayed, one sang, one listened. I ran my finger over my sister's name and felt the world tilt slightly under me. That night I spread everything out across the bed at the inn, the letters, the baptism record, the photo, and now the journal. I tried to see the pattern in it, but it was like staring into smoke. Someone had kept her alive, hidden, or raised her under a name that wasn't her own. But why? The clock on the nightstand ticked loud enough to fill the room. Near midnight, another envelope arrived under my door. I didn't hear the footsteps this time, only the small whisper of paper on carpet. Inside was a single line written in that same faint ink, "She's still in Cross Lake Hollow." I sat there holding it until the sky began to lighten, unable to decide if that was a promise or a threat. When dawn came, I found Jacob waiting at the chapel steps. He held a thermos of coffee and a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You should read this," he said, handing me another of the journals we'd found. He'd spent the night going through them. He built something inside this church, called it a sanctuary for the soul not ready for the world. I frowned. Where? He looked toward the steeple, the loft. We climbed the narrow stairs together. The wood groaned under our weight and dust rose like breath in the half-light. At the top, the air felt different, warmer close. Rows of old choir robes hung on hooks like sleeping bodies. Behind them, a section of paneling looked newer than the rest. Jacob knocked once. A hollow sound answered back. He pressed at the corner and the wall shifted with a soft click, revealing a narrow space behind it. The smell of candle wax drifted out. Inside was a small attic room no bigger than a walk-in closet lined with soundproofing foam. A cot sat in one corner, blanket-folded pillow indented like someone had just stood up. A lamp, still warm to the touch, sat beside a worn Bible and a folded note. My name was written on the front. The paper trembled in my hand as I opened it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I remember you. I never forgot. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. But I'm here. And I want you to find me. It was signed with one letter E. I had to sit down. My chest felt hollow, like air was moving through it without catching. Jacob's voice came from behind me, low and steady. "She's alive, Mara. She's been here." I looked at the floor dust, disturbed in half-moon shapes, footprints small and bare. "Not long ago," I whispered. On a small shelf beside the cot sat 3 books, a hymn book, a novel missing its cover, and a red binder with no label. I opened the binder. Inside were photographs clipped from newspapers, girls of different ages all missing. Some faces I recognized from old posters in the sheriff's office, others I'd never seen. Each photo had a name written beneath it, and at the top of the page in her handwriting a title, "The Others." Jacob stared over my shoulder, jaw tight. He kept more than one, he said. She found proof. My fingers shook as I turned the pages. Some of the girls had dates scrawled next to their names, others just question marks. At the back there was an empty space, no picture, no name, just one line written across it. "The one who never sang." Back at the inn, Bernice came by to drop off fresh towels and stopped cold when she saw the binder spread across the bed. "Where'd you get that?" she asked. Her face had gone pale. "In the chapel," I said. "Elise left it." Bernice set the towels down carefully, her eyes scanning the photographs. After a long silence, she reached out and tapped one. "I know that girl," she said. "Came through the clinic maybe 10 years ago. Wouldn't speak. Feverish, frightened. We called child services, but no one ever followed up. A week later, she was gone." She looked up at me, voice low. "They said her name was Ava, but she had another one stitched inside her coat, Grace." It was close to dusk when Bernice called the county records office, asking about an old cottage near the northern ridge. "Someone's been living there," she said after hanging up. "No utilities, but the property taxes are still paid by a church account." That was all I needed to hear. I left before the sun went down, Jacob following behind in his truck. The road narrowed to a dirt path lined with pines, and through the branches I saw faint smoke curling from a chimney. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to ache. The cottage was small, one room with a porch that sagged toward the earth. We parked a few yards away. The air was still. No sound but the crickets starting up for the night. Jacob motioned for me to wait while he stepped onto the porch. His knuckles tapped the door once, twice. No answer. He turned to me, shaking his head, and just as he started to speak, the latch clicked. The door opened a few inches. A young woman stood there barefoot, her dark hair pulled back. She looked no older than 20. Her eyes met mine wide and uncertain, and for a long moment neither of us moved. Then she said almost in a whisper, "Do you remember the doll Charlotte?" My knees nearly gave out. Her face was older, thinner, but it was hers. "Elise!" I said, my voice breaking. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "They told me you forgot." I stepped forward, shaking my head. "I never did." Inside the cottage was sparse a wood stove, a single cot, a table with a lamp that burned low. It smelled faintly of cedar and soap. Elise sat at the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, trembling. "He said if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe," she whispered. "That God only heard the silent ones." I sat beside her, careful not to startle her. "You were a child," I said softly. "None of this was your fault." She nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "I thought I was someone else for a long time. He gave me new names. Ellie, Ava, Grace, said I was saved from the fire, that the world outside would burn me again if I went back." Her voice cracked when she said I wanted to come home, but I didn't know how. I reached for her hand, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt its warmth. "You just did," I said. She leaned into me, silent tears tracing down her face. The clock on the stove ticked softly behind us, each second a sound I hadn't heard since childhood. When we finally stepped back outside, the air had cooled. The first stars were coming out above the ridge, faint and steady. Jacob stood near the truck, watching us in quiet disbelief. Elise looked around at the trees, the narrow road, the dim lights of town in the distance. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said. "Everything is," I replied. She smiled faintly, then looked at me with something like recognition. "You came back," she whispered. "I had to," I said. "Someone asked me to look in the well." We stood there a while, the three of us, until the night settled. The wind shifted through the branches, carrying that same smell of pine and ash that never really leaves this place. I thought of the letters, the cellar, the ledgers waiting in the chapel safe. I thought of the binder marked "The Others." Finding her hadn't ended anything, it had only opened another door. Somewhere more names were still buried, and whoever left those envelopes knew exactly where they were. As we drove back toward town, Elise's hand rested on the window, following the dark line of trees. "They're still here," she said softly. "All of them." I didn't ask who she meant. The road curved, and the lights of Cross Lake Hollow appeared through the mist ahead, familiar, quiet, and no longer pretending to be asleep. When morning came, the sky above Cross Lake Hollow was pale and brittle, the kind of gray that never fully decides if it means to rain. Elise sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She kept her eyes on the window like the world outside was something she was still trying to trust. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up just before 9, gravel crackling beneath the tires. 2 deputies stepped out, one young, one older, both quiet in the way people are when they've been told what not to say. They took our statements, asked for the binder, the letters, the journals. Elise spoke in a voice so soft they had to lean in to hear her. When it was over, the older one, Deputy Carden, tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, we'll do right by her." I wasn't sure which her he meant, and neither was he. The county called in the state investigators that afternoon. They went through the farmhouse, the chapel, even the cellar under the orchard. Every place told the same story: someone had built sanctuaries for the broken and then turned them into prisons. They found bone fragments near the tree line, half buried under years of fallen leaves. Human small, female. The lab would later confirm what we already knew. At least 3 other girls had been kept there long before Elise was taken. The sheriff's office called it intentional confinement resulting in death. I called it something else. Elias Root's name resurfaced in the files like a bruise you can't cover anymore. Records traced him across state lines under the alias Edward Ramsey. He'd used old church property deeds to hide his movements slipping between parishes that no one thought to connect. By the time they issued the warrant, he was already gone. He died 2 years earlier in a hospice facility under the name Brother Paul. The coroner's photo showed an old man with folded hands and clear eyes, as if the world had forgiven him without ever knowing what for. They exhumed the body anyway, took DNA and matched it to traces left in the farmhouse. It was him. The man who stole my sister from a burning house had lived to die in peace. Elise didn't say much when they told her. She sat on the porch of the cottage, rocking slowly, a blanket around her shoulders, though the air had turned warm. He used to hum, she said after a long silence, always the same hymn. Be still, my soul. Her voice barely carried. Sometimes he'd cry after. I thought that meant he was good. I didn't know what to say to that. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of magnolia through the pines. She looked out across the field and said, almost to herself, he kept saying I was the fire's gift. I believed him until the day he stopped praying. In the weeks that followed, Cross Lake Hollow tried to make sense of itself. Reporters came, but the town spoke softly, guarded. The congregation met twice under the new pastor before the church board voted to close its doors for renovation. No one wanted to pray where the walls had listened. The county put up barricades near the orchard and called it a crime scene, but even after the tape came down, no one went near it. People said the air there felt heavy, that the wind carried whispers through the well. I went back once, just before the investigators sealed it for good. The moss had grown back across the stones, green and patient. I stood there a long time, the sun low behind me, and thought about the way my father used to lower the bucket and listen for the echo before drawing it back up. That echo was gone now. The well didn't answer anymore. The FBI took the case from the county once the network of shelters came to light. They found similar safe houses across 3 states, each connected to defunct religious trusts, each containing evidence of children who'd vanished without trace. They called it faith shelters, though faith had very little to do with it. It was control disguised as salvation. There were photographs, ledgers, and letters written by the same careful hand that had written to me. They were trying to save the pure of heart from a world they believed was doomed. I remember sitting across from Agent Loren Shaw as she explained it, her voice steady but her eyes dim. They thought they were preserving innocence, she said. But all they did was bury it alive. Elise was one of the few who survived long enough to escape. The others, their names in that red binder, were less lucky. I carried those pages to the station myself. When I handed them over, the clerk slipped them into an evidence box marked Recovered Articles, Winslow Case. The sound of the lid snapping shut felt like the end of something, but not the kind of ending that lets you breathe easier. When spring came, the parish reopened the cemetery gate. The grass had grown wild around the stones, hiding the old names in shadow. Elise and I stood side by side before the empty plot where her headstone had stood all those years. Someone had laid artificial lilies there, sun-bleached and frayed. She bent down, touched the edge of the stone, and whispered, "I'm here." Her voice trembled but didn't break. I'd spent 2 decades imagining what this moment might look like, but it wasn't tears or reunion. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that finally sounds like truth. She didn't stay in Cross Lake Hollow long after that. The cottage was too small for her and too full of ghosts. She moved north, took a job in Baton Rouge, helping at a shelter for women who'd lost everything but the will to start again. Some nights she called to tell me about the ones who came in off the street, how they held their cups like they were afraid to spill. They all hum, she said once. Different songs, but the same kind of trembling. She never mentioned Elias again, not by name. I think she'd already buried him in her own way. The investigation stretched on for years. They found accomplices, men and women who'd turned a blind eye, signed papers, moved money. Most were elderly by the time charges were filed. Trials were delayed, postponed, forgotten. Justice, when it came, was measured in headlines, not healing. But I kept showing up to testify because someone had to say her name in those rooms where truth is traded like currency. Every time I said Elise Winslow, I could feel the echo of it filling space she'd been denied for half her life. The chapel reopened 3 years later under a new name, Grace Hollow Mission. I went to the service once, not out of faith but curiosity. The congregation was small. The windows had been replaced, the floorboards refinished. But at the altar, the old stone cross still stood bent slightly at the base from heat long ago. After the benediction, I left a small silver chain there, the one that had been on the altar the day Elise came home. I didn't say anything. I just walked out into the sunlight and listened to the sound of the bell ringing over the town. It was clearer than I remembered. No echo, no hesitation. Elise returned the following winter for a memorial the parish held for the victims. She sang that night, standing in the same place our father used to preach. Her voice was soft, at first almost a whisper, then steadier with each verse. "Be still, my soul," she sang, "the Lord is on thy side." The congregation joined in by the second verse. I looked around and saw people crying quietly, some with their hands clasped, others staring at the floor. When the final note faded, no one clapped. They just sat in the stillness, letting her voice settle into the air like dust after a storm. After the service, she found me near the back pew and handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a short note in her handwriting. "We can stop searching now. She's been found." I kept that note in my wallet, pressed flat between a photo of our parents and a grocery receipt from the week I first got the letter that started it all. Years later, I drove back through Cross Lake Hollow one more time. The orchard had thinned out. New houses had sprouted along the ridge where the cottage once stood. Kids' bikes leaned against mailboxes. You'd never know what the ground beneath them carried. I parked by the church and walked to the edge of the cemetery. The air was still warm, the grass alive with crickets. The well had been sealed with concrete, the stones left in a low circle like a memorial. A small plaque read, "In memory of those who were silenced and those who spoke." I traced my fingers over the metal until the letters blurred. The wind picked up through the trees, and for a second I thought I heard her voice, just the faintest echo humming that same old hymn. I've told this story 100 times in courtrooms, interviews, and depositions, but never quite like this. When I close my eyes, it isn't the fire I remember, or the letters, or even the horror of what we found underground. It's the sound of her voice that night in the chapel, strong, human, and alive. It's the way the town listened, really listened, as if hearing her meant believing she'd been real all along. Some stories don't end with justice or closure. Some end with silence finally giving way to a single steady note. And in Cross Lake Hollow, after 20 years of quiet, that was enough.